My new book, Awake, Observe, Shape, Transform, is now available on Amazon, along with the 90-day transformation journal. You'll find a link to these things in the episode description. Also, if you'd like to support this work, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers with no locked content, just a way to say I value this. You can also visit the site and check out the growing merch store, shirts, tanks, hats, and learn about one-on-one sessions with me by clicking the About button. And don't forget, the YouTube page has the podcast and binaural beats for meditation, rest, and sleep. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today we are digging into one of the most mysterious streams of Western esoteric tradition, the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, or loosely known as the Rosicrucians. We're going to talk about their hidden origins, their public emergence, the survival into the modern era, and the web of conspiracy theories around them. And above all, what all of this means for you. So, let's get started. The secret history of the Rosicrucians, hidden brotherhoods, and the esoteric rebirth. So, to understand the Rosicrucians, we first need context. What was going on in Europe around the turn of the 17th century, what cultural, religious, and intellectual forces were active. And what we know is that Europe at the time was in a state of flux. I find this to be fascinating because, a lot of times when I talk about things like this, like Rudolf Steiner, for instance, these things pop up at these weird moments in history where things are a bit tumultuous. And that's what it says in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says that, he manifests on earth in this plane when things are kind of crazy. And often when we hear that or we think about that kind of thing, like there being some sort of a God figure or whatever, we always think of it as a person. And I don't think it's always a person. I believe that ideas are manifestations of God. I believe philosophies are manifestations of God. I believe they're constantly emerging into our consciousness as a path up the mountain because not all paths are meant for all people. So that's just my little belief about it, and I don't think the Rosicrucians were any different. So at the time in Europe, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation had shaken the religious foundations of the entire continent. The Catholic Church's authority was finally being contested. New Protestant denominations were popping up everywhere, and people were asking new questions about spirituality, about authority, and about human nature. The scientific revolution was coming into existence. There was new ways of observing nature, new mathematical and mechanical models, and the old alchemical, magical traditions were still active alongside all of this emerging modern science, which is kind of crazy to think about. And mysticism, alchemy, hermeticism, and the Kabbalah were circulating in intellectual circles, right? The impulse to integrate Christian thought, classical philosophy, Jewish mystical ideas, and occult natural philosophy was strong. So for believers in hidden wisdom, the time was ripe. Everything was being questioned. Also, politically and socially, many regions in Europe were completely unstable. There were wars of religion, there was shifting alliances, there was economic change and urbanization. And in times like these, secret societies, brotherhoods, and alternative traditions claimed a completely complementary path to mainstream power structures, right? This happens when people are fed up because the political and spiritual status quo is no longer feeding the soul. It all becomes hollow legislation and not a religion with heart, as I spoke about in the previous two episodes. This actually reminds me of a quote from Don Juan Matus, the shaman from all of Carlos Castaneda's books. But this quote is from the first book, which was titled The Teaching of Don Juan, a Yaqui Way of Knowledge. Before you embark on any path, ask the question, does this path have a heart? If the answer is no, you will know it, and then you must choose another path. The trouble is, nobody asks the question, and when a man finally realizes that he has taken a path without a heart, the path is ready to kill him. And I think that's very interesting, especially in context with the previous episodes, right? That when you remove the divine feminine from a religious system, you remove God's potency. When you remove God's potency, it has no spirituality. It's just laws. So into this topsy-turvy environment enters the movement we call Rosicrucian. And as one academic summary puts it, the 3 early manifestos appeared anonymously in early modern Germany amid profound social, religious, and scientific upheaval. There we are again. Upheaval, right? Things are off, so now we have this new way of thinking. So a world of upheaval, longing for new knowledge, bridging ancient wisdom and emergent thought, looking for transformation both of individual and society, the Rosicrucian phenomenon fits into that very niche perfectly. So if we want to understand the Rosicrucians, we have to remember that this wasn't a club you could sign up for. Didn't even have a temple or a lodge or anything, but it was an idea that spread pretty quickly through Europe. It was a rumor about a hidden brotherhood of enlightened people working behind the scenes to transform the world. And if your world is a shit show, that's a really cool thing to think about. But the story begins with a mysterious figure named Christian Rosicrucian, supposedly born in 1378. He's said to have traveled through the Middle East, Egypt, the Holy Land, learning all the hidden sciences before returning to Europe to form a small brotherhood of devoted individuals that are looking for divine truth, healing, all that good stuff. Problem is, most historians don't think Rosicrucian was a real person, like most religions. They believe he's more of a symbol, like most religions. A myth representing the journey of spiritual transformation, leaving ignorance, seeking wisdom, and returning home to change, like a lot of religions. But that myth had a lot of power, and in the early 1600s, it erupted into the public with 3 strange anonymous books called the Rosicrucian Manifestos. And at the time, that was a very strange thing to happen. The first was the Fama Fraternitatis in 1614, and then the Confessio Fraternitatis in 1615, and finally the chemical with a Y, chemical spelled with Y, Marriage of Christian Rosicrucian in 1616. These were the 3 anonymous manifestos. And again, at the time, it would be like nowadays if there were 3 books that came out and they were starting to cause like a philosophical shift in society, but we don't know who wrote them, right? And that would be weird. And now, like, we at least think about it. I've said this before in other episodes. We have a reference for that kind of thing happening. But like, if you didn't have that reference, you would think that was the spookiest thing that ever happened. I mean, these weren't instruction manuals. They were invitations. Each one talked about a hidden order of enlightened men, always men, at least in print. But you got to remember that's how things were written back then. If it didn't specify man or woman, they said he or him or man. But they were dedicated to the renewal of science, religion, and society. The world was falling apart. There were wars, there was corruption, the breakdown of spiritual authority. And the Rosicrucians claimed a cure, a kind of divine science that unified spirit and matter. So if you were an alchemist, a mystic, a scholar, this hits you like lightning. The idea that somewhere out there is a secret order preserving sacred wisdom. Well, that idea lit Europe on fire. And here's the wild part. There probably wasn't. Most likely, these texts came from a small group of German mystics and reformers connected to a man named Johann Valentin Andrei, if I'm pronouncing that right. they used this legend as a way to get people thinking differently, to spark curiosity about what a spiritually renewed world would look like. Again, Rosicrucianism, if you think of it the way I'm explaining it, it's kind of a microcosm for what happens in all spiritual systems. So the Rosicrucian Brotherhood may have begun as a metaphor, but metaphors are powerful, especially when people are desperate for meaning. And don't dismiss things that are metaphors. That's how we teach. That's how we learn as children, right? The Bible is filled with parables. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, we don't know if those were historically accurate events. I believe that mystics take historically accurate events and use them to teach. That's just my belief. Well, anyway, so pamphlets and letters, they start popping up all over Europe. From people claiming to be Rosicrucians or begging to join Rosicrucianism, but no one knew who was real. Some probably believed they were part of the order. Others just used the name to lend weight to their ideas. Either way, the myth had escaped these pamphlets and was now in the culture. So by the late 1600s, the Red Cross symbol, a rose blooming from the center of a cross, had become shorthand for sacred knowledge and divine transformation. It stood for the marriage of opposites, the material and the spiritual, the suffering of the cross and the beauty of the rose, pain and blossoming. One born from the other. And the idea that suffering and awakening are two sides of the same coin is the real Rosicrucian secret. And what you see in most religious systems worth their weight, that's kind of the theme, that suffering is grace because that wakes you up. So what exactly did the Rosicrucians believe? What was at the heart of this strange brotherhood that everyone was whispering about? Well, at its core, Rosicrucianism wasn't about secret handshakes or rituals. It was a philosophy of transformation, a roadmap for turning ordinary awareness into something divine. They saw the universe as a living organism, infused with intelligence. God wasn't a bearded man in the clouds. God was the mind behind the matter, the invisible current running through every atom, every tree, every heartbeat. And to them, studying the natural world was the same as studying God. The alchemist's laboratory was a temple. The flame, the glass, the metals, all metaphors for the soul's purification. So the Rosicrucians believed that real change didn't start with governments or churches. It started with you, with the quiet reformation of your inner world, right? They called this the great work, not the work of a career or family or wealth, but the work of transmuting ignorance into wisdom and fear into love. In their view, the universe operated by divine law, what they sometimes called natural magic. But this wasn't pulling rabbits out of hats, right? It was the understanding that consciousness shapes reality and that harmony with these laws brings healing and clarity. Again, this stuff, when I say it, sounds like every New Age thought tradition that we have, but at the time, this wasn't normal. But the Rosicrucians taught that truth could be found in three sources: the book of nature, the book of your own heart, and sacred revelation. And when all three agreed, you were aligned with the divine path. Again, think about that. When you hear things like this, take off your filters, forget your filters. Does it sound right? Vibrationally. Don't worry about the dogma of the religion you're born with. Think about this, right? The book of nature, the book of your own heart, and sacred revelation. You see, they weren't anti-science. In fact, they were among the first to suggest that science and spirituality belong together, that one explains how things work and the other explains why they work. So to them, dividing the two was like cutting the soul from the body, right? Remember, the soul manifests as the physical form in this reality. They're one and the same: the mind, the soul, the body, the subtle body. And anyway, at the center of all this was compassion, not the weak kind that lets people walk all over you, but the kind that sees God in everyone. Again, we're back to a Vedic idea of equal vision. Even the ones who don't see it in themselves, they believe that service to others was the highest form of worship. Again, we're back to karma yoga leads to bhakti. Bhakti leads to karma yoga. So when you strip away the mystery, the myth, the Rosicrucians were really saying one simple thing. Wake up, remember what you are, bring that remembrance into the world and let it heal what's broken. Now, fast forward a few centuries, the world changed, but the Rose Cross didn't disappear. In the 18th century, Rosicrucian ideas fused with Freemasonry and other esoteric studies. Out of that mix comes groups like Order of the Golden Dawn. I know. And the Rosy Cross in Germany, and later the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in Britain. There's a lot of controversy around these. But again, be sure you are reading the actual literature and not literature about the literature. Anyway, by the 1800s, Rosicrucianism had gone global. You had organizations like AMORC, the Ancient Mystical Order, Rosicrucians. My Latin's horrible. Anyway, but they taught metaphysics, sacred geometry, healing meditation, and cosmic consciousness. Again, not common back then. But it sounds like, yeah, of course they do. But back then that was weird. You had the Lectorium Rosicrucianum, founded in the 1930s, blending Gnostic Christianity and mysticism. You also had the Societas Rosicruciana, connected to Freemasonry. People back then loved like mystical, magical Latin things. Anyway, different names, same thread. The idea that hidden behind ordinary life, like material life, is divine architecture, and that by studying, meditating, and serving others, you can align with it. I know, horribly satanic. So while the myth started as a whisper in the 1600s, the practice of inner transformation never really stopped. It just changed clothes to fit the century. Again, you're noticing that these things sound normal now. They weren't normal then. That was very cutting edge stuff. Now, anytime you mix secrecy, symbolism, and power, you get conspiracy theories. And the Rosicrucians have been tangled up in plenty of them. Some folks claim that the Rosicrucians control governments or banks. Others say that they discovered immortality through alchemy and hide the secret from humanity. There are even stories that they're ancient aliens in disguise, which, sure, why not at this point? I know that Jacques Vallée and others in the field of UAP, or those in the so-called Invisible College, are and were very interested in the Rosicrucians, which I always think is interesting. But for these conspiracy people that like just kind of, like, I'm a conspiracy guy, but some people, it's like this thing where like, oh, the governments the banks are controlled by Rosicrucians. You have to pick one. Is it the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Jews, the Templars? Who's doing it? And I'm not going to let you off the hook by saying they're all the same thing, because they're not. Anyway, but the truth is a lot simpler and I think more interesting. The Rosicrucian myth has always attracted people who want to believe that there's order behind chaos, that someone somewhere knows what's going on, and that's completely understandable because we live in a confusing world. Believing there's a brotherhood guiding humanity toward enlightenment, that can feel very comforting. But the belief can also become another trap, another way of giving away your power, because the real Rosicrucian work has never been about control. If you get into any of it, it was and is about waking up. The alchemy wasn't happening in a furnace, it was happening in the heart and mind. So when you hear that Rosicrucians are secretly running the planet, remember this. If they are, they're doing a pretty lousy job of it. Whoever's doing it, what the fuck? But if you take the myth as a metaphor for inner transformation, each of us could be capable of that, then it becomes something real and useful. And like I've said before, all of this text, whatever, I don't care if it's the Bible, the Quran, whatever, read it first for whatever, but then try to understand it as an allegory. And honestly, I have to say, in my own mind, I'm getting myself a little wrapped around the axle, but as someone who has collected all of the conspiracies, even raised from an early age with the knowledge of them, there is nothing more insufferable than some dickhead on YouTube or TikTok, whether it's, I don't know, older recordings of that human slug, Jordan Maxwell, Bill Cooper, or some modern day finger pointing theorist who only woke up, honestly, probably a few years ago, thanks to COVID, but spent all their time before that ignoring people like me or just making fun of us. But these characters never seem to have a dedicated spiritual practice or belief system of their own, whether it's political or spiritual. If you press them on it, they have nothing. They spend all of their time reading books about the books, or reading a book about how the spiritual system in question is corrupt, rather than reading the actual texts themselves or engaging in the practice, ceremony, or rituals themselves to find out what's true and what's nonsense. They'd rather sit there and talk shit. I mean, they're barely tourists. It's like, I don't know, looking at the Grand Canyon on Google Earth, and then having a bunch of opinions about how fucked up it is, as opposed to actually going there and hiking it yourself. When we human beings feel as though we are ostracized, left out, or othered, it registers in the same part of the brain as physical pain. And that makes sense, since being on the outside of the tribe or the village would mean certain death at some point in our lives as humans. So it's a theory of mine that these people that are constantly railing against the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Templars, it's because their default perception of reality is that they have been othered their entire life in some traumatic way. If you look inside their minds, you'd see that they've played themselves so small for so long, for their entire life. So when they see something that some other dork told them was bad or evil, rather than finding out themselves, they got trapped in the feelings and just doubled down on whatever they were told. They never looked into it. I'm digressing a lot, and I'm sure, anyway, like, you can draw loose correlations or some other factoids, but until you are willing to go to a meeting, do the reading, and find out yourself, I don't want to hear it. It's exhausting. Have the guts or the wherewithal to look the thing in the eyes, drop your guard, and dive in. Otherwise, you're just scared and full of shit, and there's nothing more dangerous than a fearful person. Because, I mean, if you're looking for truth, you have to be able to handle truth, right? Capital T. And truth, capital T, requires that you empty yourself out to let go of what you think is happening or what you think will happen. It requires fearlessness. You have to be able to sit down with what you told was evil and scary and make friends with it. Find out what it really is, right? That's how the devil fools you and tells you to shut up. Just shut up. Explore. Find out. If you're a bad person, then you're probably going to go south. If you're like a good person and you're just wanting to educate yourself, things will probably be fine. But that's exactly what a demon-possessed person would tell you. Anyway, let's bring this home. So if the Rosicrucians stood for anything, it was that humanity could evolve. And evolve not by conquering others or believing harder, but by awakening, by realizing that everything you see, quote unquote, out there, the wars, the greed, the fear, all of it begins in the individual mind. That's the alchemical fire. I know that's a horribly satanic statement. But the Rosicrucian Manifestos talked about reforming the whole world. Well, of course they did. But the world they meant was the inner one. Again, allegory is how we teach. They were saying, transform yourself and the outer world follows. This is something I say to clients all the time. Like, if I'm tired and I'm sleepy, you are going to annoy me. If I'm caffeinated and upbeat, then suddenly what you're doing isn't that annoying to me, right? Or when I'm sad or I feel less than, then the entire world feels like it's overpowering me. Again, inner stuff becomes outer stuff. As within, so without. as above, so below. So how does this translate for you and me today? Well, start by questioning the illusions that you've accepted as real, the labels you cling to, the systems that keep you small, okay? Anything that keeps you small, that shrinks you down, should be looked at. Set it on fire, flip it upside down, see what it's made of, right? The Rosicrucians invite you not to join an organization, but to enter a new state of awareness. You don't need a secret brotherhood to do this. You don't need to know the password or handshakes. You just need to stop identifying with the noise and remember that within you is a kind of Rosicrucian chamber, a silent place where your own inner alchemist is already working, right? Every time you choose patience or anger, compassion over judgment, awareness over distraction, you're performing the same alchemy they wrote about centuries ago. And that's the real initiation. So, sorry, my mouth is dry and I'm stumbling over my tongue. Anyway, so put a bow on it here. The Rosicrucians, they emerged when the world was coming apart. Again, think about that. And they offered a vision of renewal through wisdom and inner transformation. And like most systems that are seeking truth and not just a bunch of goddamn rules, you have to have the nerve to take the ride, not just spectate, right? I want you to think about this idea within Hinduism that God manifests when the world is in turmoil, right? So the Rosicrucian story inspired so many people. It inspired philosophers, scientists, mystics, reformers. It mutated, survived, and reappeared in different forms right up until right now. And of course, conspiracies grew around it because secrecy attracts projection. But the heart of the message is always timeless. The world changes when you do. I'll say it again. The world changes when you do. Okay? Remember that. The rose, the cross, it's you. The suffering, the blooming, the paradox of human life turning toward light, that's you. And maybe that's the secret that the Rosicrucians were, quote unquote, guarding all along. So I love you. Stay awake. Thank you. If the infinite spark of being has brought you any value, consider supporting the work. And you can do that by checking out Awake and the 90-Day Transformation Journal, both now available on Amazon. The links are in the description. If you want to support this work on a monthly basis, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers that have no locked content yet, just support. You can also swing by the website, check out the merch store, learn more about working with me one-on-one, and as always, the YouTube page has full episodes as well as binaural beats to help you with your practice. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, and I love you.